All right, Brian Miner on the podcast today. I'm super excited to have you, man, because I have followed your stuff from afar for a long time. You just mentioned Alberto before we started recording. 3DMJ was one of the first guys I found on YouTube years ago when I first became a coach and heard a lot of concepts, and then I was introduced to your content through Eric and Albert, and I've listened to a bunch of podcasts with you on it. So it's cool to have you on here, man. I'm excited to dive into this topic. But before we do dive into the topic of today, can you give the listeners an idea of who Brian is and maybe how you got into fitness in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first off, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to chat about this. So I've been coaching full time for about 5 years, and then was, coaching kind of on the side for a few, 3, 4 years before that. I went to school at Colorado State University, and got my undergrad in construction management. So something totally unrelated to this. And I've always been interested in training and nutrition, but I ended up doing construction management and then graduated right in the middle of the recession and went back to school. Went to grad school, took some prerequisites and got into grad school for health and exercise. And when I was done with that, started I actually went back and was working construction for a while as I sort of built up my business on the side, while I did, construction management and stuff. And then, in 2015 was able to transition over to this full time. So it's been a journey to get here. But it's been fun. It's a lot of my, thoughts have just kind of evolved over time. There's, aspects, I think, like any coach, there's points of view that you have that, change over time significantly. And I think this is one of those topics that we're going to discuss. So I'm excited.
This is kind of just a selfish question. I'm just curious. Would you identify yourself more as a bodybuilder or a powerlifter? Because you've done both, correct?
Yeah. I wouldn't really identify myself as either. I know what you're saying. I guess it's kind of like a 50-50 split, to be honest. I think I'm probably a better bodybuilder than I am a powerlifter. I've competed in 2 natural pro seasons, 2 different seasons, 2012, 2017. And I actually earned my pro card in 2012, but I've still only competed across 3 competitive seasons. So I think I've done 7 shows total. So I don't have a ton of show experience. But it's been, I guess I compete infrequently enough in it. And that's kind of the big reason that it's hard for me to really consider myself like a natural bodybuilder when I only, or identify solely as that if I am only competing every half decade, So
Yeah.
it's, so I guess it just kind of depends on where I'm at. Right now I'm just in the off season trying to, get bigger and stronger. And it's, when it comes time to, in the off season, to do a meet, I just sort of dial up the specificity for, 8 to 12 weeks towards powerlifting and kind of go more or less like maintenance mode on some of the more bodybuilding, isolation type stuff, like biceps and
Right.
delts and calves. It's like those are put on the back burner, just more for time than anything. But the focus, I think if there's anything that kind of gets sacrificed by doing both, it's just kind of the opportunity cost of peaking for a meet. I mean, that's time away from trying to grow. But as a natural athlete, it's like in the grand scheme of things, we're not talking much size that you're leaving on the table by doing that. So it's been, it's a good question. I get it a lot, actually, and I'm not sure. I'd say I prefer the structure and the strategy behind powerlifting. I like the athletic element to it, the performance element to it. And I think, some people would argue the same for bodybuilding, but all of the bodybuilding stuff is like, if you do your work well in advance, I mean, that's there's no really game day execution. I mean, there is, but not like there is in powerlifting.
Yeah.
I like the performance element just growing up playing sports.
So, and I don't know if this term's gonna make you cringe or if you actually like it, but like power building is kind of like what we're talking about here in a way. Um, do you think as a natural, it's actually better or worse to do that? And the reason I say that is because it's so hard to build any type of muscle at all. Because I don't compete. I have competed before, but I'm in my off season. I'm working with coaches just trying to get bigger too. But it's a very long and slow process of trying to gain weight as a natural. Do you think it's almost like because of that patience it requires and how slow it is and how specific you have to be, it's almost better to not split between the two because then you can actually squeeze out everything? Or you think it's such a small difference that it actually doesn't really matter? You're probably going to get the same gains long term anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And I think it depends on the individual. I know for me, like having that competitive element, it's like the carrot that's in front of me at all times. Like I would get burned out with just going in and doing bodybuilding work. I think after a while the training would feel a little bit uninspired, to be honest. So for me, it actually helps, I think, the big picture cause for muscle growth because it keeps me engaged in the training. But from a purely like physiological muscle growth perspective, I think a lot of people, like the saying, jack of all trades is a master of none. Like it's true that, the principle of specificity, especially for strength, I mean, that's something that needs to be, acknowledged if you're going to try to express strength to the highest degree. But, hypertrophy isn't really a specific adaptation. Like there's, I mean, it is an adaptation, but it's not like you can't train specifically for hypertrophy without training somewhat, at least. Like you could say hypertrophy is training like upstream strength potential. It's increasing your capacity to produce force by building bigger muscle. And so like I think in powerlifters, we know it, as you gain experience, the most predictive variable for strength in experienced lifters is going to be muscle mass. And so, it is the one thing that we have control over for like over the long term. Like, yes, muscle mass slows down. Does it ever completely stop? Probably not, if we're doing everything right. It could, be very slow, but there's a lot of lifters, I think, that are so focused on the specificity side of powerlifting and not wanting to, cross this imaginary line and focus on, quote unquote bodybuilding, but they end up in the process sort of sabotaging their long-term potential for strength. And so a lot of, and you see this a lot now, I think more people are starting to, like I would say more powerlifters see the benefits. Like I don't think you would get the same argument from powerlifters that you can't do both as you would from bodybuilders. Like I think bodybuilders look at it from a different perspective, whereas powerlifters that understand what goes into expressing strength, they see bodybuilding as part of a bigger picture. And hypertrophy helps with strength more than strength is going to help with hypertrophy. So, so the bodybuilding side of things helps with strength, but if I was purely just a power or a bodybuilder, like, no, I wouldn't train, my 1 rep max. I wouldn't do heavy, doubles and triples. But at the end of the day, it's like we know that hypertrophy is not it's not intensity specific. Like we can still make those loads conducive to the overall theme of training. Like I could still have a training block that, biases hypertrophy and, training volume, that includes some high intensity exposure. So it's not like if I took a bodybuilding program, like a great, hypertrophy emphasized program, and added, some conservative singles or doubles, top sets preceding some of the volume work, like it's not all of a sudden going to just, soak up all of these recovery demands by doing, a few additional reps per week. It's I think the biggest issue is for managing both is time, and I think it's connective tissue integrity, because we know that like you can grow using heavy loads, you can grow using light loads, and on a set by set basis, we know roughly anywhere from 6 to 30 reps, we can kind of count things on a set to set basis. So like 3 sets of 8 versus 3 sets of 15, those are going to have similar hypertrophic effects. So when you look at it from that perspective, you can see how the strength training side of things, it can still build muscle. Those high intensities can still build muscle. You just have to dose it strategically so you're not getting hurt. Managing the wear and tear that it has a tendency to put on people. If you're getting all of your volume from high intensities like that, you're going to hit a wall pretty quick, but you're still going to grow from it, so at the end of the day, I think where it's kind of tricky, and I think where there's some misconceptions is, that high intensity strength training isn't going to benefit hypertrophy at all, and it still can. It just needs to be dosed appropriately, or that high volume training, that's more submaximal serves no purpose for strength, and it muscle mass. It's just not like like you wouldn't want to do it during a peaking phase. And so, I think if you're spending 8 to 12 weeks peaking for a meet, like it's time away from, I guess, growing. If you just sort of assume the goal there is to actualize your strength potential, through neurological and skill acquisition, avenues. The hypertrophy side of things, you're more or less maintaining muscle mass. When you bring down volume to start to bring down fatigue, you're focusing more on muscle maintenance. And so as a bodybuilder, you can look at that and think like this is very counterproductive, and perhaps, but it also could, one, if there is something to, resensitization in terms of volume, which, there is some evidence that there could be, stepping away or dialing back from volume, there's like an enhanced response once you do return to it. There's research that looks at groups that trained I forget what the duration was, but one group I think trained 16 weeks straight, and the other group, I think they took 2-week breaks every so many weeks, and they actually at the end of the study had similar amounts of muscle growth. And so we're talking like total, detraining, and stepping out of the gym. But when they come back in, they see, they're obviously seeing an accelerated rate when they come back into the gym if they end with the same amount of muscle as the other group. And so, I think an argument could be made that, these peaking phases could, in a sense, resensitize you to volume for, subsequent hypertrophy phases. But I think people in both camps or both sports we like to look at things strictly on, what's physiologically optimal, and not enough attention is given to, what is going to keep us engaged in the training and putting effort into the training. And I think that's a big one for me, is, getting that change of pace, change of, short-term goal. You're not sabotaging your other goal. You're just kind of putting things on hold. And then, the amount of muscle that, let's say there's no resensitization element to it, the amount of muscle mass you're losing out on by, a 8 to 12 week peaking phase is going to be relatively minimal for an advanced athlete, so, and for like an intermediate athlete, or a beginner, you might not need to have like a traditional peaking phase where you radically pull back on volume. Like you can sort of have a peaking phase where, you're still above, what you could consider like MEV for hypertrophy, but you're pushing higher intensities. You're getting that volume from higher intensities, and the fatigue management side isn't as big of a concern because you're not lifting, you're not as advanced of an athlete. Like each unit of work is just a little bit less taxing. So sometimes in those cases, it's not a radical change. It's implementing some high intensity top sets, 2-3 times a week, and getting people familiar with lifting heavy loads and going from there. So I think there's a lot of people that are adamant that it's very suboptimal, and I don't think that's the case. When you consider everything, I mean, I wouldn't have a power lifter train, medial, if they're, like a Bryce Lewis that we were just talking about. I wouldn't, if I were, his coach, Eric Helms, and he may include some of this, just for fun, but like there's really no reason I would program like medial delts or chest flies, unless like there was like clearly a developmental issue, like say his pecs just had a hard time growing and like we needed some low stress, low fatigue stimulus there. But for somebody that's like at a high level of powerlifting, you wouldn't include those movements. But even if you do include those, it's not that much additional training stress. Like your overall systemic fatigue isn't going to go up that much more by doing a few sets of bicep curls and lateral raises, and some calves. Yeah. And I kind of look at, the power building approach is, we're still focusing on hypertrophy, but as we approach the meet, we're dialing up specificity. It's like the competition lifts can become more of our vehicle for accruing the training volume that we are getting. So it's minimal amounts of time where you're, I think, leaving gains on the table ultimately. And I know that was kind of a disorganized rant, but it's
No.
yeah, I don't think it's as big of a deal as people make it out to be. I don't think it's required to optimize. Like I don't think it's optimal, but I don't think it's grossly suboptimal either.
I think you actually brought up a lot of really good points, like one being just adherence and motivation to train. Like I think that's something a lot of people forget about and I talk about quite often. And it's funny because Eric Trexler writes all my programming and everything. And it's really cool because we kind of have like a coactive relationship. He kind of like lets me discuss it with him. And after 16 weeks of not dipping below 8 reps, not because, and I think this is a good point you kind of made too, in a way, it's not that 8 to 12 rep range is best for hypertrophy. It's just, okay, what's the most productive use of your time for the main goal, which is hypertrophy? It's probably going to be staying up in that range, which is funny because studies came out and it's like, you can do any rep range, but you should still do the 8 to 15 rep range kind of thing.
Yeah, it's efficient.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but after 16 weeks, I was like, man, I need some 3s and 5s. Like I'm dying. So we added, bench, squat, and deadlift. All right, 5s and 3s. Like, let me just lift some heavy weights. it's not really going to negatively impact much, but it just gave me like motivation to train, because it's like, how much can I squat today? Like, oh, it's squat day, it's bench day. And that feels good, rather than doing 8 reps on a barbell bench press, 8 reps on a
Yeah.
squat, you know? So I think that's really important, but I am curious of your thoughts on kind of the relationship between, intensity and volume. There's kind of like these two camps, right? Like there's the volume camp, obviously. And I think there's a lot of evidence to prove that. And then there's this intensity camp that's more like a Dorian Yates style approach, where maybe they're not doing much volume, but they are training balls to the wall with intensity and effort. And there's not many studies doing that kind of stuff. It's more bro science, but the guys are jacked. So it's like, it's kind of like one of those things where, people are kind of choosing sides. Do you think there is a balance? Like, how do you even balance those two?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm trying to think of the best way to dive into this, because there's a lot of different directions
Mm-hmm.
to go. But I think both methods will work. At the end of the day, it's like, if you're doing adequate volume and you're working hard in the gym, there's going to likely be some muscle growth that's following suit, you know?
Yeah.
So even the people that are pushing high intensities, like they're accruing enough volume to grow. And so it's not that volume isn't important. It's, you know, I guess when we look at volume, we have to first define, you know, what that is. And in research, it's often looked at as, you know, sets times reps times load, or like volume load tonnage, it's sometimes called. And so that's sort of like a proxy for, it's a proxy for internal stress. And, you know, the load on the bar and the weight we lift, it's just a means to an end to get us to an imposed stress on the physiological level, you know, that causes a, you know, biochemical cascade of events, you know, for muscle protein synthesis. And so I think sometimes we get caught up in like mathematical levels of volume, and we have to realize that, you know, high intensity work, like, yeah, it might be one set, but you're also getting, it's a set that's dosed very aggressively, you know. And so your level of effort there, you're going to get more overall tension on, you know, the high threshold muscle fibers that have, you know, the greatest propensity for growth. So I think on like a set to set basis, and this kind of goes into the conversation of, you know, training close to failure, and this is a topic that's currently getting like a decent amount of attention. And I know Greg Nuckols recently wrote an article on his website looking at, or, you know, showed that trained lifters can get away training a little bit further from failure than, you know, novice trainees. And that's something I think that lines up with the anecdote as well. But, you know, we know that volume is, you know, or each set, it's a vehicle for the magnitude of tension and a duration of exposure to that tension. And so like you can look at like the effective reps concept, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not, but like, you know, there's definitely flaws to this model, and Greg has a great article on that as well. But the basic premise is, you know, the reps that are going to contribute to growth the most are the ones that are under, you know, full degrees of motor unit recruitment. And I don't think many people would argue that, you know, to grow a muscle optimally anyway, or to, you know, for a muscle fiber to hypertrophy, it's got to be activated. You know, it's got to be actually having, you know, creating or generating force to have tension put on it. And so I think where the discrepancy there comes into play is where where does that happen in a set and for a given exercise? For squats, how far from failure do you start, calling into action these higher threshold muscle fibers? And it's likely lower than most people think. And sometimes like I know Chris Beardsley has mentioned 5 reps in reserve. Anything there and below is sort of like the active or basically the effective reps. I don't think he calls them, I think you might call them hypertrophy reps or something. But those are the reps that are going to have the biggest bang for your buck, basically. And it makes sense, at least on some scale, that as you fatigue in a set, you call in higher threshold muscle fibers, you're going to start generating force with those, putting tension on them, and that's what's going to lead to hypertrophy. Whereas just doing lots of mathematical volume that is very submaximal, you could end up with very little magnitude and duration of exposure to tension on those higher threshold fibers. And so there's a level of requisite effort that's required in order to optimize muscle growth. Training to failure is, I don't think is necessary. I think the data is pretty clear that that's not necessary. And in trained athletes, I think it's likely suboptimal in many cases. And I kind of have mixed opinions of this. Like, some of this kind of goes into like the fatigue management side of things. I think sometimes we look at things from a perspective of how do we optimize the stimulus, when we have to think of it as how do we optimize the balance between the stimulus and our ability to recover from it so we can turn around and apply it again. And training to failure, even if that was the best way to leave no doubt that adequate stimulus was applied, it's also exponentially more fatiguing. Like if you even training like a couple reps in reserve, like from that to 0 reps in reserve, if you're going to do a set, like say you did a set with 2 RIR and then did another set with the same load 5 minutes later, or we'll say 2 minutes later, you're going to perform significantly better with that than if you would have gone to failure on that first set. So that fatigue rises significantly when you start training to true failure. And there's like mechanical failure, and then there's like true like grind through Dorian Yates style failure. And I personally don't think there's any reason to do that, because I think that's when you start running into issues with high amounts of potentially high amounts of muscle damage, which are then going to impact your performance in subsequent sessions. And so I think a lot of people in the high intensity camp sort of ignore the residual effects of applying a very assertive stimulus like that. And I think people that are in the high volume camp at times disregard the importance of putting in adequate effort. And that doesn't mean training to failure. It just means training close enough to failure to make sure that you're at least putting tension where you want it, that right. You're forcing, the fibers that have the greatest growth potential, that they're being forced to do some work. And so, so both are important. It's not one versus the other. Like they both are important. And the way we're kind of referring to intensity here is like relative effort, proximity to failure. Whereas, we can talk about load on the bar, and we kind of alluded to that in the last question. We don't have any evidence to really indicate that, heavier loads are more beneficial to lighter loads when it comes to hypertrophy. as long as it's over like 30%.
Yeah.
So I think when we're looking at effort per set, it's got to be adequate, does not need to be to failure. And, being able to train a little bit short of failure, you're then able to do, turn around on your next set, perform a little bit better. And at the end of the day, like your bottom line stimulus may be greater, and you may have better, with less cost associated with it in terms of fatigue. And
do you think that, two follow-up questions on that. Number one, do you think that going to failure, I don't want to say it's better for beginners because sometimes that's more dangerous because they don't have skill, but also I feel like a lot of people say, oh, that's 2 RIR. And I'm like, you're not even close to failure because they don't understand what that is. And I almost think like the maximal effort failure training that I did as like I was programming incorrectly actually taught me a lot on how to do it better today. And then almost too, like kind of summarizing what you said, and you can correct me if you think this is right, but like hypertrophy is going to occur from tension being applied to the muscle fiber, right? So volume, intensity, different training splits, all these things, it's kind of like, well, really it's almost like calories, right? What's the best avenue to create the right amount of tension for you, right? If that's intensity, great. If that's volume, great. Just like calories, like, oh, intermittent fasting, cool, calorie deficit. Keto, cool, calorie deficit. Like it, it kind of always stems back to that. Would that be true?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both though. And I think some people just bias one. I wouldn't really even say, I mean, they're both required.
Yeah.
Like you need to have adequate intensity, you need to have adequate volume, but there's a lot of people that prefer, like if we're considering volume, number of sets, I think if we were to sort of distill the argument down, there's people that argue fewer sets of absolute maximum effort versus more sets with slightly less than maximum effort. And yeah, in that case, I think it's, like some of it comes down to, we talked about the psychological side of things, like enjoyment. I mean, there's people that just really enjoy going in, like, they watch that Dorian Yates blood and guts video before they go in and train. It's like, leaving reps in reserve isn't, it sounds, like they're committing a crime. And so I think, I agree. I think it's there's lots of ways to get to it, especially with hypertrophy. And like, this is sort of along the topic of progressive overload, but I think a lot of people that just go into the gym and they have no structure, like a lot of those guys are still pretty jacked, and it's because they're still checking the boxes that they need to check. Like they're still going in, they're putting effort in, they're doing adequate amounts of volume, and they're getting a stimulus because of it, and if they're training close to failure, it's like as they adapt, they're still, they're still keeping pace with those adaptations because they're training to failure. And so it's built in. If you're training to failure every session, the one nice thing about it is a diagnostic tool to tell you if you are progressing, because that number should go up over time.
Yeah.
And so, those people that are just going in and, that are having the conversation with their training buddy, like in the parking lot, what body part are we going to hit today? Or, what exercise do you want to do next? Like that, they're still achieving the most important factor, and that's putting tension, adequate amounts of tension where they need it. And then as they get stronger, since they're training to failure anyway, or close to failure, they end up just doing more reps in the process, or, increasing weight and doing similar amounts of reps. And so, that is one nice thing about training to failure, is it forces people to have a progression format in place, even though it doesn't sound like it is a progression format, because as adaptations occur, they're right there keeping pace with them by, you know, staying at this, wherever that ceiling is, they're pushing up to it every single session. So, you know, as that ceiling raises, they're right there pushing up to it again. And so, so I think there's benefits there. And you had mentioned, I think in the research, you know, they don't really train like blood and guts style. And I agree. I think there's, they do often train to failure though, but you have to look at the population. Like you said, you know, 2 reps in reserve, is this true failure? And I think, I'm sure it depends on the study. I mean, I've never conducted resistance training research. So I don't know, like I've never really witnessed one of these studies take place in front of me. And so seeing, you know, someone who's resistance trained at least 6 months, you know, that can squat 1.5 times their body weight, you know, seeing them trained to failure on a set of squats, it's like I don't know exactly what that's going to look like in the lab, you know. And so versus someone with high amounts of experience. But what I can say is if we have evidence that you don't need to train to absolute failure to, you know, and let's say on average, even, you know, trained in the research is generally not like super advanced, you know, it's usually, you know, I think most would agree that it's like late novice, intermediate type lifters, you know, that are kind of considered trained in the research. You know, sometimes getting people that have been training at least a year, you know, that's considered trained, you know, training 3 times a week for at least a year. Like that's not uncommon to see. But if we see them is benefiting or getting adequate or similar progress training a little bit shy of failure, then like people will critique it like, well, this was done in novices. Well, if anything,
Proves the point more.
this supports the fact that advanced athletes would benefit from it as well, you know, because they're actually pushing to failure. And so if a novice is, you know, stopping at, you know, about 5 RIR and, or, you know, 3 to 5 RIR and getting, you know, similar progress, when in reality maybe they're actually like 8 RIR, then you know, it makes you think like in this case, like that argument of it wasn't in advanced trainees is, I don't say it's not invalid, because like science is based off of, you know, the population that you're studying and the interpretation, but I think mechanistically there's no reason why advanced athletes wouldn't benefit from it as much or more, because they're carrying more stress per set, like in terms of like acute fatigue as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's something people forget too, is like I think the more advanced you are, the more systemically fatiguing it is to go closer to failure. So 2 RIR to me, training 8 to 9 years is different than somebody 2 RIR training for a year or two, not only from a standpoint of, maybe not from a muscle growth perspective, but from a fatigue standpoint, 100%, you know, because I have more of a skill, I like to think. And I think like as somebody who's trained for 8 or 9 years, I think I thought I was like advanced lifter at 3 years, and then I hit like 5 years and I was like, man, I'm still an intermediate. Like the more that I learned, I was like, no, I'm not really there yet. But you mentioned progression like really quick, and I really want to, like, that was the original topic we were going to dive into. So I want to kind of shift gears into that. And in my first question, and then you can kind of tell us what your theory or your way of doing it is one, how did that even start? Like, how did you like be almost known for understanding progression for hypertrophy so well? Because I've heard you speak on it. It's like people have sought you out to speak on that exact topic. So I'm curious how that came about, and then also like what your method is. I mean, obviously there's, you know, we can add load, we can add reps, and then there's also people who like to add sets over the course of weeks. Does it matter, or do you have a certain thing that you think works best?
Yeah, a lot of the overload stuff, for one, I want to make it clear. It kind of like makes me cringe a little bit when people, they think of me just as like the the guy that talks about overload. It's like,
Right.
oh, I get asked to talk about it a lot. And I think it has, if there's going to be one, a topic to discuss a lot that's grossly misunderstood as a whole, I think like I like talking about it because I think it has implications that spread out, the entire way we structure our training. Um, but it kind of, it's not anything I discovered by any means. I mean, I know, um, I forget when I first sort of, the seed was planted in my head, like, the idea of overload. um, I was always sort of told, like, the story of, a lot of people are exposed to this, how they're introduced to the idea of overload, like Milo of Croton, the Greek wrestler, and the bull. And like, you hear that story, like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, he adapts. He's forced to get stronger as the bull gets larger. And that's sort of the takeaway is, you apply, if the force is there, or if the demand is there and you expose yourself to it, now you need to, like, that is a stressor that your body is not ready for, and is a defense mechanism. We get stronger to be able to cope with that. um and there's elements of that are true, but I think where it gets lost, is people think that they kind of get it backwards a little bit, and it is sort of a chicken and the egg scenario where, we do need to add load, or we do need to progress in order to keep adapting. Like, we do, otherwise we would, you know just stagnate, and stall. But what a lot of people kind of forget or don't understand is that what we do in the gym, or like overload, I mean, the term overload, I like to define it as, it's simply achieving a stimulus that's adequate for an adaptation to occur. And that is not predicated on what you just did. So, and I think sometimes that's where people get lost with overload, is they think, okay, I did this last time or last week. Now I need to do more. Now I need to push myself a little bit further. And that's true, but it's on a much longer scale. And so, there's nothing wrong necessarily. Well, there's pros and cons, I should say, but there's nothing just straight up wrong with plans that add things session to session. I think from a psychological perspective, it can be helpful. And from a stress perspective, an applied stress perspective, it can be beneficial as well. But what progressive overload ultimately is it's keeping pace with adaptations. And so we know there's like a range of effective volumes. There's like the minimum effective, in the maximum, like this inverted U, that we, within that, will see positive muscle growth from. So if we apply a stimulus and we adapt to it, what that does is it increases those adaptations, sort of increase our ceiling. So say we're doing 10 reps at a 2 RAR the first session. Once we adapt, maybe we can do 11 reps at a 2 RAR, and so it pushes that up a little bit. And we want, in order to continue to apply a similar, like, relative stimulus, we need to keep pace with those adaptations. And so, like, this is where I think the effective reps model can be like a useful teaching tool. Because let's say it's the last 5 reps before failure. Let's pretend that's all that matters. And like that's where I don't think and I guess I don't know his position on it right now, but Chris Beardsley has received, the idea of the last 5 reps has received some critique with it, not being a line in the sand, like the last 5 reps are the only reps that matter. But let's pretend for a second they do. And I like his model, especially for teaching purposes. But if it's the last 5 reps, say you do a set of 10 to 2 RIR. So you leave, you have 3 reps that are effective, Then let's say if you were to do 10 reps, but now it's a 3 RIR because you've adapted and it's now easier, you've only done 2 effective reps. And so you could not change anything as long as you're performing adequate volume and if you're within that acceptable volume range and you're applying enough stimulus to these high threshold fibers, or just muscle fiber in general, you're going to grow. So you could, in theory, not change anything. You could do 3 sets of 10 with the same load for a month straight potentially, and still see forward progress, still see small amounts of muscle growth following every single one of those sessions. It's just, when you first start out, it's going to push that ceiling a little bit higher, and now you have less effective stimulus, and then it's going to push a little higher, and you have less effective stimulus, and then it's going to push a little higher, and then you have even less. And so as you adapt, we need to keep pace with that new, as our fitness goes up, we need to keep the stimulus at a place that's going to continue to impose reasonable amounts of overload. And so that's it's our own adaptations that are dictating our progression within our the rate that we're adapting is dictating how much we can add to the bar, how many reps we can do, and it's nothing that our body isn't already capable of doing. It's not like this imposed shock to our system that our body is incapable of handling, and we need to grow muscle in order to cope with this stressor. And I think that's sometimes how people conceptualize it. It's that we've adapted, and in order to continue to make the set difficult, we need to either do more reps or add load. And if the set's not difficult, then we're not putting tension on the fibers that we want. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you have speaking of actual programming this, do you have a way that you prefer to do it as far as when to add reps versus when to add load? And you didn't even mention adding sets week to week. And I think that's a fairly new idea that more so Mike Israel talks about quite a bit. Yeah. And I've always personally kind of not like that, just because I feel like it's hard. And as the weeks go on, you feel like you're in the gym longer and longer. But then, there's people like Steve Hall, who's a natural bodybuilder who is killing it. And I look at his physique and I'm like, well, man, maybe it is legit, So, but again, I think that stems back to adherence. I wouldn't personally be able to be motivated to adhere to that. So I think that's the overarching thing. But when it comes to actual program design, do you have certain places where you go with load progressions versus rep progressions, or do you just stick with one per block? How do you like to design it?
Yeah, it's a good question. That there's a difference between adding load and adding reps versus adding sets. And Eric Helms recently wrote a great article for Mass about this. And he and I and Jacob Skepis with JPS recently wrote a reply to the original mesocycle progression article that Mike put out with some of our additional thoughts on it and critiques. And once it's published, people can read that. But like adding sets isn't an indication that progress has been made. It's an indication that you've decided to do one more set, you know? And so adding load and adding reps, when we talk about increasing the stimulus to keep pace with adaptations that are occurring, like, yeah, you could look at adding sets as like your work capacity has gone up. Now you can add a set. You could look at it from that perspective. But ultimately, as you get stronger and build muscle on a set to set basis, either adding load or adding reps is going to continue to put tension on the high threshold muscle fibers, you know. And so those are the two primary avenues, like on an acute basis, that I work with. And like rather than like I use sort of a just a auto-regulated form of double progression a lot of the time. And so rarely do I have like a completely static model where I say, you know, like traditional double progression, it might say 3 sets of 8 this week, 3 sets of 9 next week, 3 sets of 10. Now that increase 5 pounds, 3 sets of 8, you know, and so there's nothing like that will work. But it's, I think an argument could be made that it could be very suboptimal for somebody who's adapting very well. Like you take a beginner who is seeing, you know, reasonable degrees of adaptation between sessions. You know, you might be able to take a beginner and, you know, week 1, they're, you know, you could add 5 pounds to a lift from, you know, one session to the next, and the weight move the exact same, you know, like that's an indication of actual progress. And so like keeping pace with the adaptations requires like somewhat of an auto-regulated approach. And so what I'll do is like a double progression model, but I'll say 3 sets of 8 to 12, for example, maintaining like 2 RAR. And so person will fall somewhere in that range. You know, they'll pick a load that, you know, the first week that'll put them somewhere in that range. And then, you know, they'll go through their sets. And if they feel like say the first set they get 10 reps, the next set they get 8 reps. And then the third set, they realize if I keep the load the same, I'm not going to get this. And so they might lower the weight for that third set in order to stay in that rep range. So it's adjusting the load to stay in like a loading zone. But then anytime like the next week, anytime like the week prior that you hit the top end of the rep range, I'll have people increase the weight for that set. And so what it does is the load increases are based off of a performance, which falls in line with the theme of, you know, a stimulus is based off the rate of adaptation, you know. And so as we perform better and we show that, okay, now we need to increase the load in order to stay within this loading zone, then we increase the loading. And sometimes, like if you were to like take someone who's like a beginner who's adapting very quickly, they may say they get, you know, on the first set 100 pounds for 12 reps at 2 RIR. Then the next week they go 105 pounds, but they actually get 12 reps again at 2 RIR. Like they're adapting very quickly. And so if we were using a static model, you know, we may end up having them do 100 pounds for, or like 105 pounds for 8 reps rather than going up to 12 already. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's allowing them to, based off of their readiness on the day, you know, the fitness and fatigue dynamic there, but also their, you know, their, I guess, adaptation is wrapped into the fitness element. So based off of their readiness, it's allowing them to push the stimulus when they're able to push it. And if they don't have, you know, say they have high fatigue or they're not adapting well, the rate of progression in the stimulus is a lot slower. And so, I like that tool a lot. I mean, and it's one of a number of like reactive training strategies that are out there. And actually, we have a quick plug here. JPS and I forget his last name, Melvin. There's this online hypertrophy summit this next month. It's really cheap. It's like $40 American for
I'm already getting it.
hours of but I'm presenting on reactive progression strategies, and so if people are interested in kind of learning some of the other ways, that would be something good to sign up for.
There's a lot of good speakers on that panel.
Yeah, it should be cool. But anyway, the whole point is the optimal stimulus for a given day isn't necessarily it's not influenced at all on what we just did or what we did immediately prior or a week prior. It's dictated by our readiness for the day and the magnitude of adaptations up to that point. And if we're progressing and adapting well and recovering well, I mean, it's auto-regulation basically. It's respecting variances in each individual's ability to recover and adapt, or lack of ability to do that at an optimal rate. So that's kind of I don't have a preferred way, but if there's going to be, like, I like to start with reps oftentimes, because like that's the smallest unit of increase that you can have. And like you're going to be able to increase reps at a given load, keeping all else equal, before you're going to be able to increase load, keeping all else equal. And so, at least I would think in pretty much all the cases. So, and we talked about like adding sets, and I had said, if adding sets is really just, it's a means of increasing the stimulus, but it's not really necessarily based off of rate of adaptation, especially if you're doing it in a proactive manner. Work capacity as it increases, but there's really no way to assess on the fly where your work capacity is in terms of, recovery, recuperative ability on a session to session basis. But like adding load statically is sort of similar to adding sets, because if you just add load, like if I did 100 pounds at 4 RIR, or say 100 pounds for 4 reps at 4 RIR, and then the next session I did 105 pounds for 3 reps at 5 RIR, that's like, I did more weight, but I didn't, it's not a better performance, it just shows that I added weight. And so that's not a progression in the stimulus at all. It just shows that I decided to add load, and either no significant adaptation has occurred, or fatigue could be masking that at that moment in time. And so I like it when the progression of the stimulus can also serve as a diagnostic tool over time into the effectiveness of the current strategy. Like if we know across a block, if we see performance trending up for a lift, like say we use that auto-regulated double progression model, and we're using 5 more pounds for all our sets, keeping all else equal, and by the end of the mesocycle, throughout that we've been increasing reps each week, here and there, and it's been occurring organically, like that's likely a sign. I mean, it's strong evidence that you're heading in the right direction, in terms of like the stimulus is likely effective. And some people may say like, well, fatigue can influence performance. And so how do you decipher that? And that's true. But across a training block, like fatigue is usually increasing. So if you're increasing performance in the face of, in the presence of escalating fatigue, then like if anything, fatigue is making it look less favorable than it actually is, rather than making it look more favorable. So yeah, I like, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Like power lifters, I do think there's something to be said for strength athletes being able to increase load every week in a plan. I think mentally it helps. I know for me at least, gradually having more, weight on the bar, holding more weight, rather than just piling on, all this weight at once, once you get stronger. Like I think having that gradual exposure to increasing loads is important from a comfort level. But there's ways to do that still in an auto-regulated manner. Like you could statically increase load every, by 5 pounds every single week for a lift, but just take each set up to, a certain RIR, like 3 RIR, and just let, reps naturally, unless you're just adapting phenomenally and making some insane progress, but gradually, just let reps sort of come down as, as the load goes up. And so you're still able to, you can still assess the effectiveness of the strategy if you use like, you can estimate your max based off of a, performance for, say your first set. But I like using that sometimes too. And so there's lots of different ways to do it. Adding sets isn't my preferred way to do it. And I think, I'll hold off on really talking about that, because I know there's going to be more discussions about this in the future. Hopefully, with Eric and myself and Mike, and Jacob, and I think Jared Feather, hopefully. So yeah, it should be a good discussion. I think there's some pros to that model, but I also think there's some assumptions that that are made within that model as well, that can may make it a less optimal choice than maybe perhaps keeping sets the same, or just having a more reactive way to managing your volume.
I think a lot of people get into the more is better thing, and that's why they assume more sets might be good. But if it's not applying the right tension or the right stimulus that you want, or the right stress, then it's kind of just like you said, it's just time. You're just spending more time there. But I like the double progression method a lot, actually. It's something similar to what I use in all, especially with a lateral raise, for example. Like, okay, 25-pound dumbbells, 10 to 12 reps. I might be only at 3 sets of 10 right now, but I'm going to stay here until I can get 3 sets of 12 with this 20-pound. And then maybe I'll bump up to 25 and go like 8 to 10. Cause like we know a 5-pound jump on a lateral raise is actually pretty damn big.
Yeah.
But over time, you're making those small progressions with just reps. But I think the problem I see, we work with a lot of Gen Pop people. The problem I see with Gen Pop is just that you gotta be patient, and I think that sometimes people have trouble like being patient with their logbook and just kind of tracking progress over time. But I think, at the end of the day, that's what makes great bodybuilders great too, is they're patient as hell and they're willing to just, do the work and track the progress slowly.
Yeah. One thing that you mentioned that I meant to circle back to in one of my tangents there was, you had mentioned you were kind of glad early on that it taught you a lot training close to failure. And I agree with you. Like, I think it made me respect the rate of progress that I had at a young age. And, when I first got into it, and because I think a lot of people now, and, I'm sure the social media, I'm sure has a lot to do with this. Like they have expectations of what progress should look like. And I find a lot of like beginners when they're, you know, they're unsatisfied, even if they're doing everything right, they're often unsatisfied with the rate of progress, which is like that. It's a bad sign if that's the case is a beginner, you know, like because it's only going to get worse from there, you know. So um, so I think, yeah, managing expectations in that population and not necessarily you know, making them shoot lower. It's getting them to appreciate the rate of progress that they're actually making in the grand scheme of things. You know, like 5 pound, you know, take a power lifter who, you know, adds 5 pounds to their squat, you know, every block. Like, it doesn't seem like much. It's a lot of work in the moment. You know, you're grinding session, you know, session to session. It just does not seem like a lot. But at the end of 2 years, it's like, you do the math. I mean, it'd be what if a block is like, say, 5 weeks, so about 100 pounds, you know. So it adds up. And I think for beginners, it can be really tricky, like you said, to get them to look like, because they've never had the experience of being able to look back and see how far they've come. They all they're doing is looking forward, you know. And so it's harder for a novice to appreciate, or a general population athlete to appreciate the small steps forward that they're taking as part of a bigger picture. And yeah, it's tricky. And I respect anybody who, you know, works with a lot of general population athletes, because it's one of the more difficult it's I think the most difficult population to work with, because there's a lot of, it comes down to, you know, not so much what's physiologically optimal on paper, but what is, you know, behaviorally optimal. And I think that is a good experience for people, you know, for new coaches, is to work with general population individuals, because it teaches them how to manage an athlete's, you know, emotions to a large degree. And then, you know, as you get more advanced, the smaller details matter more and more. But yeah, there's a lot of people that, like, it kind of cracks me up, powerlifters that, you know, micromanage their own training, you know, very, very, you know, in tune with how everything is integrated within their programming, but they're also, you know, eating less than triple digits of protein per day, you know. And it's like it's just putting the wrong, you know, level of amount of focus. So you can get a lot out of the basics.
Yeah.
Like, if you master, like, very few people master the basics, and the people that do end up being in that top, like, 5% usually. And it's yeah, it just takes patience, like you said.
I think that's the tricky part about Gen Pop is you have to find creative ways to help them master the basics. And there's, you know, I've had people ask me, because so when I first started this phase of trying to gain, it was like, I think we went almost like 14 or 15 weeks before even tweaking the program, because I was just progressing and I was gaining weight and I was getting stronger. And it's like, well, why would we change it? And then I have like Gen Pop where, like, well, you change my program every 3 weeks. And I'm like,
Yeah.
you know, it takes me longer to progress. So I'm going to keep going, and I don't get bored quickly. So for some Gen
Yeah.
Pop, I'm like, I'm purely just changing it so you stay motivated to get in there and get after it.
Yeah. You know, I was having this conversation the other day with one of my athletes, I think. I forget who it was, but um, is a coach, like, as a young coach, I found that I almost had that pressure. If someone's paying me money to program for them,
Yeah, you got
it's
to
like
change something.
you feel like this obligation, and sometimes they do expect it. Like, you feel this obligation to tweak something, otherwise you feel like you're not doing anything. You
Yeah.
know, you're not serving a purpose. But
They do that with
it's one of
macros
those,
too.
huh?
Same thing with
Oh
macros.
yeah. It's like really, it's like if you're doing if you nailed it, it shouldn't require a lot of work after that. Like
Hmm.
I mean, communication, but um, yeah, minimal adjustments. And I think some people look to coaches, and I think they just have a skewed perception of what's required to reach a goal. Because there's a lot of people that I think they manipulate things too or excessively, but they still make good progress. And so some people see that and think, okay, like I need to do this. You know,
Hmm.
I need to um, rotate in new accessory movements every single block, and change rep ranges every single block. When if things are going well, it's like you just keep rolling with it.
Yeah.
But then like you said with Gen Pop, it's like things can be going well, but people can be getting bored with it, which is that's a tricky scenario. You almost have to figure out creative ways. It's like as a parent trying to like figure out a way to like get your kid to eat vegetables, so you start like hiding it and shit.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm gonna hide the same program with just like I'll just kind of move these things around to make it look, but
Yeah.
it's really you're really doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
It's so
it's
true. It's so true. It's funny because I try to tell people, like when someone's like, "Hey, we haven't changed anything. It's been 8 weeks." I'm like, "That's a good thing. Like you're making
Mhm,
really good progress. Why would I cut
mhm,
calories or add cardio or do anything if you're continually
mhm.
making progress?" Or like you said, I've told people like sometimes like almost trick my clients into think they're doing something different. Like
Yeah.
the squat stays the same, but we're changing the reverse lunge to a split squat. And it's like
Yeah.
to them, it's something crazy different. But you know what? If that makes you excited to keep going, then I'm gonna do
Yeah.
that every few weeks because I want you to keep doing it. But
Yeah.
I love that, man. I want to respect your time. We've been on here for just about over an hour. I could probably ask you like 20 more questions and have a bunch of different conversations. And I appreciate that you actually took every question and kind of went on like 4 different tangents. And I really like
Yeah.
that actually because there's, good coaches say the words, "it depends" so much. And I love when I talk to somebody and you almost can't answer a question with like
Yeah.
a black and white, like this is the
Yeah.
answer. So I appreciate that. And I know the people listening
That's
do.
good. Because
Yeah.
sometimes I go on these, and I know sometimes yeah, it's like as I start thinking of ways to answer it, other things like all these contingencies start
Yeah.
popping into your head, and so it never flows out quite as smooth as you hope. But
And that's
yeah.
why it's actually hard for me to write blogs anymore because
Mm,
I'm like 20,000 words in. I'm like, well, there's so many scenarios that this could go. And I just
mm,
keep going and going and going.
yeah.
But no, I love it, man. I think the people listening do too, as well, because I do it quite often. But where can everybody find you? Website, Instagram, wherever you're located most at?
So my website is myojournal, myojournal.com. You can find out there's a blog articles there, coaching information, contact form, and everything. And then Instagram is at BD Minor, and yeah, it's probably the best place.
Perfect. I'll link both those in the show notes for everybody to check it out. A lot of good content coming from him. And I would like even just follow just to see the content he's featured on because that's how I found you and you're on a bunch of things. And like I said, the
Yeah,
Hypertrophy Summit's coming up. I'm assuming you'll be posting when that's live and I highly recommend people check that out because it's a lot of I was really excited to see that. There's a lot of good speakers there. But man, thank you for taking the time with me. I appreciate it.
yeah. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, Cody.